Our relationship, once so full of laughter and warmth, had turned cold. Sarah and I hadn't been together all that long, barely 2 years, but lately, it felt like she was pulling away from me more and more with each passing day. It started gradually a missed dinner here, a few late nights there, but then, before I knew it, everything felt off. The change was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it was there, like a silent tension that hung in the air between us. I'd ask her how her day went, and she'd reply with one-word answers, her gaze focused on her phone instead of me. When I tried to make plans, her response was lukewarm, as if our time together was just another chore to check off her list. The once effortless flow of our conversations now felt forced, as though she was always holding something back. Every time I'd ask about the future trips we'd talked about, or even moving into a bigger place, she'd brush it off with a half-hearted excuse. Let's just live in the moment, Daniel. It stung more than I'd ever admit. Then came the long hours at work. Sarah's job in marketing had always kept her busy, but now she was staying later than ever. She'd say things like, "This project is taking up all my time," or, "My boss is really pushing for this to get done." At first, I bought her explanations, even sympathized with her stress. I'd cook dinner and wait up for her, trying to be supportive. But slowly, her excuses grew thinner and harder to believe. One evening, she came home hours after she'd said she would, reeking of perfume that wasn't her usual scent. "Got held up," she mumbled, barely glancing in my direction before heading off to the shower without so much as a hug. I sat there at the dinner table, staring at the cold food I'd made, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I should trust her, but that nagging feeling refused to go away. Over the next few weeks, our arguments escalated. They'd start over the smallest things, like who left the dishes in the sink or why she hadn't told me she'd be working late. But these fights always ended the same way, with her dismissing me, saying I was making too big a deal out of nothing. "You're always looking for problems, Daniel," she'd snap, her tone dripping with exasperation. I'd bite my tongue, knowing that pushing her would only make things worse, but the doubts kept creeping in. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah had mentioned she was going out with some colleagues for team bonding dinner. She was already dressed to the nines, her makeup perfect, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy as she checked her reflection one last time. "I'll be back late," she said, not meeting my eyes. I watched her leave, my mind swirling with questions. Something didn't add up. Later that night, as I sat alone, my phone lit up with a message from Mike, a friend of ours. "Hey man, thought you'd want to know I saw Sarah at the lounge. She was with some guy I didn't recognize. Seemed pretty cozy." My heart stopped. I read the message over and over, trying to make sense of it. Sarah had told me she was with colleagues, not some guy. I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help. When she came back that night, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. She slipped in beside me quietly, smelling faintly of wine and that same unfamiliar perfume. As she settled in, I felt a strange mix of sadness and anger wash over me. Could she really be lying to me? I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. If she was cheating, I needed proof, something she couldn't deny. The next few days felt like torture. I'd catch myself watching her, looking for any sign that she was lying to me. She'd avoid my gaze, her phone clutched tightly in her hand like a lifeline. She'd text often, tilting the screen away from me when I was nearby, or she'd take her calls in the next room, lowering her voice just enough so I couldn't hear. My suspicions only grew stronger. Then, one evening, I decided to check her phone. She'd left it charging in the kitchen, and the temptation was too strong to resist. I unlocked it and scrolled through her messages, but there was nothing unusual, just work-related chats and messages from her friends. My stomach twisted with guilt for even checking, but something told me not to stop. That's when I noticed her deleted messages. There was a string of gaps in her conversation history, like missing pieces to a puzzle. A few days later, she announced another late night at work, throwing on a fresh set of makeup even though she'd just come home. She didn't say much before leaving, only muttering something about an important client meeting. I wanted to believe her, But the image of her with that mysterious man Mike had seen kept flashing through my mind. I needed answers, and I was done waiting around. I texted Mike, asking if he'd keep an eye out for Sarah that night. He agreed, saying he'd let me know if he saw anything. I spent the evening pacing around our living room, glancing at my phone every few minutes, waiting for some kind of news. Hours passed, and just when I was about to give up, my phone buzzed. It was Mike again. "She's here, man," he wrote, "and she's with the same guy. I'm sorry, but they don't look like just friends." My hands shook as I read his message. This was the confirmation I dreaded, but couldn't ignore. I was filled with a mix of anger and sadness, the weight of betrayal settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to confront her, or if I even wanted to. But one thing was clear. Sarah was hiding something from me, and I couldn't let it go. When she finally came home, I pretended to be asleep again, listening as she moved around the room quietly. The scent of that unfamiliar perfume filled the air, and I could feel the space between us growing wider and colder. I lay there in the darkness, realizing that our relationship was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The next morning, I looked at her across the breakfast table, studying her expression as she talked about her plans for the day. She seemed so distant, almost like she was here in body but somewhere else entirely in spirit. I wanted to ask her about the man, about why she was lying to me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I needed more than just suspicion. I needed to know the full truth, and I would find it, no matter what it took. From that moment, my focus was set. I'd find out what she was hiding, uncover every lie she'd been telling me. If Sarah thought she could keep this from me, she was wrong. I wouldn't let her destroy our relationship with her secrets, and I wasn't about to sit back and watch her walk all over my trust. I deserved better. I knew I couldn't stay passive anymore. If Sarah was hiding something, I had to know the truth. I decided to start small, watching for clues, subtle things she might not think twice about. The more I observed, the clearer it became that her actions didn't align with her words. The day after I got that text from Mike, Sarah came home late. I asked how her work dinner went, and she barely looked me in the eye as she muttered something about a long meeting and catching up with her boss. I felt a tightness in my chest as I nodded, pretending to believe her, but I couldn't ignore the guilt in her voice, the way she seemed to avoid my gaze. I started noticing patterns. There were specific nights she'd work late, and it always seemed to follow a day where we'd argued. It was as if, after every fight, she needed an escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was waiting for her on those nights. I found myself questioning every detail, every excuse she gave me. Yet, whenever I tried to bring it up, she'd dodge my questions and shift the blame, accusing me of being overly suspicious. A week later, I got another message, this time from James, a friend of ours who was out with his wife. "Hey, Daniel," he texted. "Just thought you should know. Saw Sarah with the same guy again. Not sure if it's anything, but they seemed pretty friendly." I felt my hands shake as I read his message. My suspicions were turning into undeniable evidence, and the more I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it, the harder it became. Our arguments grew more frequent. I could barely hold back my frustration as I asked her, "Why have you been spending so many nights out? Why don't you ever want to talk about us, about the future?" She'd respond with a cold look, a dismissive shrug, like I was being unreasonable. "It's just work, Daniel. You're imagining things," she'd say, her voice dripping with irritation. As the tension between us thickened, I took the next step. I didn't want to, but I felt like I had no choice. I installed a location tracking app on her phone. Part of me hated myself for crossing that line, but I needed to see where she was going, needed to know if my worst fears were true. Over the next few days, I tracked her movements, waiting for a pattern to emerge. One evening, Sarah told me she'd be working late again. Sure enough, the app showed her leaving work at a reasonable hour, but she didn't come home. Instead, she went to a part of town where we never usually go, an area with bars and upscale lounges. The dot on the screen showed her staying in one spot for hours. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with questions. What could she possibly be doing there? Then, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was at work when I received a call from Mike again. He hesitated, and then said, Daniel, I don't want to make this worse, but you should know I saw Sarah with that same guy at a cafe this morning. They didn't look like colleagues, man. I just thought you should know. It was the last straw. I knew without a doubt that she was seeing someone else. The lies, the evasions, the excuses, it all made sense now. I had hoped, even up until that moment, that I was wrong, that I was just overthinking things. But the truth was there, laid bare by her actions, and there was no denying it anymore. I sat at my desk, numb, staring blankly at the computer screen. All those months of doubt, suspicion, and sleepless nights had led to this. Sarah was betraying me, and she'd been doing it for longer than I wanted to admit. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If she was going to lie to me, I'd gather everything I needed to confront her. And this time, I wouldn't let her talk her way out of it. It didn't take long after Mike's last message for me to realize that I had to confront Sarah. But I wanted to do it carefully. I needed to be certain she couldn't lie her way out of this. I spent the next few days observing, holding my breath, waiting for the right moment. By then, I had collected enough evidence to expose her, and I was ready to end this nightmare. But before that, something unexpected happened. One evening, I ran into Jessica, my ex-girlfriend, while out getting groceries. We hadn't seen each other in years, but she looked just like I remembered, warm and open, a comforting presence. We got to talking, and soon coffee turned into dinner. Jessica had no idea what I was going through, but somehow, being with her felt like coming up for air after being underwater for so long. I told her about the struggles in my marriage, and it felt liberating to finally speak openly. She listened without judgment, just nodding along, and I felt a pull I hadn't felt in years. The next few days, Sarah continued her usual routine of late nights and vague excuses. But I was done with her lies. Meeting Jessica had stirred something in me, a reminder of what it felt like to be valued and respected. I decided to act on that feeling. Jessica and I started seeing each other more regularly, and what started as friendly dinners quickly became something more. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but it was like I couldn't help myself. With each passing day, I grew less interested in the web of lies Sarah was spinning and more focused on the freedom I was beginning to feel. Jessica and I shared so much that I'd been missing with Sarah: laughter, understanding, and honesty. I wasn't proud of my decision to see Jessica, but after everything Sarah had done, I felt justified. I couldn't keep giving everything to a relationship that was already broken. The breaking point came one Friday evening, about a week after I'd started seeing Jessica. Sarah came home late again, smelling of perfume that wasn't her usual scent. She barely looked at me as she walked in, tossing her purse on the counter like it was just another normal day. I couldn't take it anymore. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." She froze, glancing at me with a mixture of irritation and mild fear. "What now?" she snapped, clearly expecting another argument. But this time was different. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let my anger get the best of me. I simply looked her in the eye and said, "I know about him, Sarah. I know everything." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that her secrets had finally caught up with her. She stammered, "Daniel, it's not what you think." "Oh, isn't it?" I replied, my tone calm but my words biting. "Then why don't you tell me exactly what it is? Why don't you explain why you've been lying to me for months, going out with another man while pretending to work late?" She tried to come up with an excuse, some way to weasel her way out, but the evidence was overwhelming. It was just a mistake, Daniel. I swear, it didn't mean anything. He was just someone to talk to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Someone to talk to? Sarah, you've been lying to my face for months. Our friends have seen you with him, and you've been caught more than once. How long were you planning to keep this going?" She shook her head, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I don't know, Daniel. I don't know what came over me. It was just, everything felt so strained between us. I thought maybe." "Don't you dare blame this on me," I cut in, my voice sharp. "You chose this. You chose to break our trust, to destroy everything we've built together. Don't act like this is anyone's fault but your own." The room fell silent, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of suspicion and doubt had lifted, replaced by a cold clarity. I could see everything clearly now: the lies, the betrayal, the damage she had done. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before saying the words I'd been holding back. And just so you know, you weren't the only one who found someone to talk to. Her eyes widened as she looked at me, realization dawning on her face. What are you saying? I met someone, Sarah. Someone who doesn't lie to me. Someone who actually respects me. Her name is Jessica, and being with her made me realize that I'm done wasting my time with someone who clearly doesn't care. I saw a flicker of pain in her eyes, and for a split second, I felt a pang of guilt. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by the anger that had been simmering inside me for months. I wasn't the one who had betrayed our marriage first. I wasn't the one who had broken promises and lied. Sarah's voice cracked as she whispered, "Daniel, please, we can fix this. It was just a mistake, I promise. It won't happen again." But I'd heard enough. I shook my head, my voice firm and final. "No, Sarah, I'm done. You made your choice and I made mine. This marriage is over." She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled back, feeling nothing but numbness where love had once been. The realization hit her, and I watched as she crumbled, tears streaming down her face. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her, not anymore. I turned and walked toward the door, feeling an odd mix of relief and sadness. I knew there was no going back from this, no salvaging what was left of our marriage. But for the first time, I felt free from the lies, the doubt, and the pain that had consumed me for so long. I knew I couldn't stay silent much longer. Sarah's lies were unraveling, and all I needed was proof, something concrete that she couldn't explain away. The trust we'd built had been eroding for months, and the thought of watching her deceive me one more time felt unbearable. So, I decided to do what I'd once thought unthinkable. I was going to track her every move. The next day, I took the first step. I bought a simple GPS tracker, small enough to attach to her car without her noticing. I was careful, discreetly installing it one night while she was asleep. I could barely recognize myself, sneaking around and planning these things, but Sarah had left me with no choice. I had to know the truth. The waiting was the worst part. Every day, I checked the app on my phone, watching as the little that represented her location moved around town. Most days, she followed her usual routine: work, gym, errands. I almost started to feel like I was overreacting, letting my suspicions get the better of me. But then, on a Thursday evening, the dot led me somewhere I hadn't expected. That night, Sarah claimed she had another work meeting, some client dinner she had to attend. As I watched the tracker, she left her office and drove toward a part of town we rarely visited. I zoomed in, heart pounding, as her location settled at a trendy restaurant I knew well. It was one we used to go to for special occasions, a place that held a lot of memories for us. I fought the urge to drive over there, to see with my own eyes who she was with. Instead, I texted a mutual friend, Carl, who lived nearby. I asked him if he could casually swing by the restaurant and see if Sarah was there, maybe even take a picture. Carl knew about my suspicions, and although he was reluctant, he eventually agreed. After what felt like hours, Carl sent me a message. "She's here, Daniel. She's with some guy. They're at the bar, just the two of them." He attached a photo, taken from a distance, but it was clear enough I could see Sarah laughing, her hand resting lightly on a man's shoulder, her body language relaxed and intimate in a way I hadn't seen with me in months. My stomach twisted at the sight. This wasn't just some friendly conversation. This was something deeper, something I hadn't wanted to believe until I saw it. The next few days were a blur. I was consumed by anger, replaying that photo over and over in my mind. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew she'd just deflect or twist my words. I needed more proof she couldn't deny. That's when I decided to take things further. I'd start with her phone. The next evening, I waited until she was asleep, then took her phone to the living room, keeping it close enough to the Wi-Fi to access her messages. With a cloning app, I transferred her recent texts, emails, and call logs onto my device. My hands shook as I sifted through the messages, unsure of what I might find. Most of her recent messages were work-related or with friends, nothing that stood out. But then I came across a thread with someone saved under a fake name, Alex, and that's when the truth hit me harder than I'd ever expected. Their conversation wasn't long, but it was painfully clear. There were messages like, "Had an amazing time with you tonight. Can't wait to see you again," and "Hope Daniel didn't suspect anything when you got home." My heart pounded as I scrolled through each line, trying to absorb what I was seeing. I felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under me. Every suspicion, every doubt I'd pushed aside had been true all along. That weekend, I set up tiny cameras around the house, mostly in rooms where she'd usually go to take her calls or text Alex. I was determined to gather everything I needed to see for myself if there was any part of Sarah's story that wasn't a lie. On Sunday afternoon, while she was out running errands, I retrieved the footage from the past day and reviewed it in our living room. As I scanned through the video, I watched Sarah in the kitchen, laughing as she looked down at her phone, her face lit up by messages she'd been hiding from me. Then, later, there she was again, sitting on our bed, typing on her phone with that same gleam in her eyes, a gleam I hadn't seen directed at me in ages. Watching her, seeing her betrayal in real time, was like being stabbed with a knife that just kept twisting. The next night, I watched the tracker app as she left for another late meeting. She drove to an address I didn't recognize, somewhere far from her office, somewhere she'd never mentioned before. I jotted down the address and searched it online, only to find it belonged to a downtown hotel. I couldn't ignore it anymore. She wasn't just emotionally distant, she was all in with someone else, someone she'd been lying to me about from the beginning. My head spun as I took in what I'd discovered, feeling like the world I knew was slipping away piece by piece. Memories of us flashed through my mind, the vacations we'd taken, the plans we'd made, the life we'd shared. It was all a lie. I had once thought of her as my partner, my best friend, the one person I could trust. Now I couldn't recognize the woman I'd married. On Tuesday, I decided to put my findings together, compiling every message, every location, every instance of her betrayal into a file on my phone. I organized each piece of evidence like a case file, a record of every moment she'd chosen to lie, to betray, to hurt me. I'd gone from feeling hurt to numb to a cold determination. I wanted Sarah to face the truth of what she'd done and understand just how deeply she'd broken me. It was clear that our relationship couldn't continue. I had always believed in working through issues and giving second chances, but this wasn't something I could forgive. I'd been the last one to know, the one kept in the dark while she led a double life. Every time she'd laughed at a text, every moment she'd come home late, every excuse she'd given, it had all been to cover up her betrayal. I couldn't keep this inside any longer. The next time Sarah and I were alone, I'd confront her with everything I had gathered. She could try to lie, try to deny it all, but I was ready. I had the proof, and there was no escaping it. Sarah had destroyed my trust, our relationship, and everything we'd built together. It was time for her to face the consequences. After gathering all the evidence, I felt ready to finally face Sarah and lay everything out. I was done feeling betrayed, done watching her slip further away while I pretended not to notice. Every doubt, every suspicion was now backed by hard proof, and there was no avoiding the truth. That Friday night, Sarah came home around 10, using the same old excuse, late meeting with clients. I was sitting in the living room, waiting, my mind churning with everything I wanted to say. She glanced at me as she walked in, probably sensing that something was different. "Daniel, what are you doing up so late?" she asked, feigning innocence, her tone casual as she kicked off her shoes. I looked at her, a sense of calm settling over me. "We need to talk, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She stiffened, just slightly, and I saw a flash of worry in her eyes. She tried to brush it off, saying, "Can it wait? I'm exhausted." "No, it can't wait," I replied firmly, gesturing to the seat across from me. She sat down, looking wary. "I know everything, Sarah," I said, my voice steady but laced with the anger I'd been holding back for months. Her face paled, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could see her mind racing, trying to piece together what I knew and what she could still deny. What do you mean?" she finally stammered. her voice barely a whisper. Let's start with Alex, I said, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes widened, and she looked down, the weight of her guilt clear on her face. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with him, meeting up at restaurants, hotels, and lying to my face every time you told me you had work meetings or client dinners. She shook her head, her voice breaking as she tried to explain. Daniel, it's not what you think. Alex is just a friend, I swear. Her words sounded weak, even to her. She couldn't meet my eyes, her voice trailing off as if she already knew it was pointless. A friend? I scoffed, pulling out my phone and opening the file I'd compiled. Here, let me remind you what kind of friend Alex is. These are messages from your phone, Sarah. All those times you said you had to work late or that you'd be out with colleagues. I tracked your location. I have photos, texts, everything. Her face fell, and she buried her face in her hands, mumbling, I didn't want you to find out like this. I was going to end it, I swear. End it? I asked, my voice rising. Sarah, you've been lying to me for months. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? How much I tried to believe you, to make excuses for you? I've been living in this nightmare because of you. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I didn't mean to hurt you. Things haven't been right between us for a while, and I didn't know how to fix it. So you thought cheating was the answer? I shot back, my voice harsh. You thought going behind my back with some guy was going to fix our marriage? She started to cry harder, her shoulders shaking. I was confused. I didn't know what to do. I was unhappy, and I didn't feel like you were there for me anymore. I felt a pang of bitterness rise in my chest. So you think I was checked out? Do you have any idea what I've been going through? The nights I've stayed up worrying about you, trying to figure out if I was imagining things? I was here, Sarah. I was always here. But you made the choice to destroy everything. She reached out, trying to take my hand, but I pulled away, the anger simmering inside me. You think I'm going to forgive you, just like that? I asked, my voice shaking. After everything I found out, you really think I just let this go? Daniel, please, she whispered, desperation clear in her eyes. I know I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we can get past this. We can go to counseling, talk things out. I don't want to lose you. I shook my head, feeling the last threads of sympathy snapping. It's too late for that. You lied to me, over and over again. And you know what? You weren't the only one who found someone to talk to. Her eyes widened, and she stared at me, shock and betrayal mixing on her face. What do you mean? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I met someone too. Someone who actually respects me, who's honest with me. Her name is Jessica, and she's shown me what it feels like to be cared for again. I saw the color drain from Sarah's face, the reality of her actions sinking in. You cheated on me, she choked out, looking as though the wind had been knocked out of her. I let out a bitter laugh. Funny, isn't it? How the tables have turned. The difference is, I didn't lie to you for months. I didn't pretend to love you while sneaking around behind your back. I only did it after I realized that you had betrayed me, after I saw that there was nothing left to save. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing as she muttered, Daniel, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I thought you didn't care anymore. I took a deep breath, my anger softening into a strange sense of finality. Well, now you know. Now you know what it feels like to be lied to feel like you're the last one to see the truth. I stood up, my decision made. I'm done, Sarah. I'll be filing for divorce on Monday. There's no point in dragging this out any longer. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Please, Daniel, can't we try one last time? I still love you. I shook my head, feeling nothing but emptiness where love had once been. No, Sarah, I can't do this anymore. I deserve better than this, better than you. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, the echo of her sobs following me as I closed the door behind me. As I stood there, catching my breath, I realized something. The weight of betrayal was finally lifting. I had faced the truth, and it was ugly and painful, but it was mine to bear, and I was free of it now, free to start over without her lies holding me back. After our confrontation, the house felt like a stranger's place. Every corner seemed haunted by memories, reminders of the years we'd spent building a life that now felt meaningless. Sarah tried to act as if things could go back to normal, offering to make dinner, trying to strike up small talk, but I ignored it all. She could pretend all she wanted, but I was already a step out the door. That weekend, I made arrangements to move out. I didn't see the point in dragging this out. She noticed, of course, the boxes in the hallway, the suitcases packed and waiting by the door, and it drove her to desperation. I found her waiting for me that Sunday evening, her face drawn, her eyes red from crying. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaky, "please, just sit and talk with me one last time. We can still fix this." I stood there, looking at her, feeling only exhaustion. I'd gone through every emotion imaginable: anger, sadness, betrayal, but now there was only numbness. Still, I sat down, if only to give her the closure she needed. "What do you want to say, Sarah?" I asked, my tone flat. She took a deep breath, her voice cracking as she spoke. "I know I messed up. I know that. But I love you, Daniel. I always have. What happened with Alex, it was a mistake. I was lonely. I felt disconnected, and he was just there. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never stopped loving you." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "You think that excuse is everything? Sarah, you spent months lying to me, sneaking around with him while pretending everything was fine. You didn't care about us then, so why should I believe you care now?" She shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. "It wasn't like that. I was confused, and I made a terrible mistake. But it's over with him. I ended it. You and I, we still have a chance. We can rebuild this, I swear." I looked away, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Rebuild what, Sarah? The life you shattered? The trust you destroyed? There's nothing left here." She fell silent, her eyes searching mine for any trace of forgiveness, but I had none left to give. Seeing she was getting nowhere, she tried a different tactic. "You cheated too, Daniel," she said, her tone almost accusing. "You wanted someone else too. How can you stand there and judge me when you did the exact same thing?" "That's different," I replied, feeling a fresh wave of frustration. "What I did with Jessica happened after I already knew you'd betrayed me. I was hurt, broken. You can't compare that to what you did, lying to me for months, deceiving me every single day. I only went to Jessica after I had no faith left in us." She bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought you didn't care about me anymore," she whispered. "You were distant, always busy. I didn't know what else to do." I leaned forward, my voice low and cold. "So, your answer was to run into someone else's arms? You think that's what love is, Sarah? Love isn't leaving when things get hard. It's staying, working things out together. But you chose to lie, to break us. You made this choice, not me." The weight of my words seemed to hit her, and she broke down, sobbing. She kept pleading, reaching out for my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Her betrayal had cut too deep, and all I could feel was the sharp sting of her actions. After a long, painful silence, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "Please, Daniel, I'll do anything to make this right. I'll go to therapy. We can work through this together. Just, please, don't leave me." I looked at her, searching for a trace of the woman I'd once loved, but all I saw was a stranger who had torn my world apart. "I can't stay, Sarah. This is beyond repair. I've already filed for divorce." She looked shattered, her face contorting with pain and disbelief. "You really mean that, don't you?" she whispered. "You're really leaving me?" "Yes," I replied, the finality in my voice surprising even me. "I can't live with someone I don't trust, someone who betrayed me. This marriage is over." Sarah let out a shuddering breath, her eyes filled with resignation. For the first time, she looked defeated, like she knew there was nothing she could say or do to change my mind. "If that's what you want," she said quietly, wiping her tears away, "then I won't try to stop you. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I truly am." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. I know you are, Sarah, but sometimes sorry isn't enough. With that, I stood up, leaving her sitting there, a shadow of the person I'd once thought I'd spend my life with. I picked up my bags, the few belongings I had decided to take with me, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, she called out one last time, "Daniel, please don't go. Don't leave like this." I turned to look at her, my gaze steady. "Goodbye, Sarah." And with that, I left, stepping out into the cool night air, leaving behind the weight of a broken marriage. As I drove away, the finality of it all sank in. This chapter of my life was over, and though it was painful, there was a strange sense of freedom, too. I was free from the lies, the hurt, the betrayal. In the days that followed, I didn't look back. The divorce paperwork moved forward, and soon enough, the ties between us would be officially severed. Jessica and I continued seeing each other, but I was cautious, careful not to rush into anything. She understood what I'd been through, respected my need to take things slow, and for the first time, I felt like I was rebuilding my life on honest ground. As I settled into this new chapter, I found myself grateful for the hard truths I'd faced. Sarah's betrayal had nearly broken me, but it had also shown me what I deserved, what I would no longer settle for. The final blow had been painful, but it had also set me free. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the hardest lessons come wrapped in betrayal, and sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. In the weeks following our final confrontation, life felt surreal. I'd gone from a man consumed by suspicion and hurt to someone in the process of rebuilding his life, one day at a time. Moving out and getting through the initial steps of the divorce had been difficult, but with each passing day, I felt a strange lightness, as if the weight of Sarah's lies was finally lifting off my shoulders. I was free to make choices without the shadow of betrayal looming over me, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. Jessica was a big part of that newfound hope. We took things slowly, meeting for coffee, taking walks, and talking for hours about everything and nothing. She didn't push or pry but simply listened, giving me the space I needed to heal and move forward. Being with her felt easy, natural. There was no need for pretenses, no unspoken tension or doubts. She understood that I was coming out of a difficult situation and respected my pace. One evening, Jessica and I met at a small cafe by the lake, one of our favorite places. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the water, and as we sat there, I realized how much I'd come to value her presence in my life. There was a calmness between us, a feeling of being understood without needing to explain every detail. We didn't have to fill every silence. Instead, we just enjoyed each other's company, a simple connection that felt solid and real. "Daniel," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "how are you really feeling? With everything that's happened?" I paused, thinking over her question. It wasn't easy to put into words, but I owed her my honesty. "Honestly," I replied, looking out over the lake. "It's been hard. Letting go of the life I thought I had, coming to terms with how things ended with Sarah. It hasn't been easy. But sitting here with you, I feel like I'm finally moving on. I feel like I can breathe again." She smiled, her eyes warm and understanding. "That's all I want for you, Daniel. To find peace, however that looks for you." She reached out and took my hand, a simple gesture that held so much meaning. That night, as I drove home, I thought about the future for the first time in months. I'd spent so long focusing on the past, on the betrayal and the lies, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward, to imagine a life that wasn't defined by hurt. Being with Jessica reminded me that there was still good in the world, that love didn't have to be complicated or filled with secrets. The divorce with Sarah was finalized shortly after. When I walked out of that courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a faint sense of victory. I'd faced the worst, and I'd come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger for it. I was no longer the man who would overlook lies or accept excuses. I was ready for a new chapter, one that was defined by honesty, respect, and trust. With Jessica, things continued to blossom naturally. She introduced me to her close friends, who welcomed me with open arms. We planned trips, explored new places, and created memories that were ours alone, untainted by the shadows of the past. I'd spent so long feeling guarded, but with Jessica, I found myself opening up, sharing pieces of myself that I hadn't even realized I'd kept hidden. There was one particular weekend trip that stood out. We decided to go hiking in the mountains, a place I'd always loved but hadn't visited in years. The crisp air, the breathtaking views, and the quiet of the forest filled me with a peace I hadn't felt in so long. At one point, we stopped at a clearing with a view that stretched for miles, and Jessica took my hand, squeezing it as we stood there in silence. "I can see why you love it here," she said, her voice soft. "It's like the world just fades away." I nodded, feeling an unexpected swell of emotion. It's like hitting reset, a chance to leave everything behind and just be. I looked at her, realizing how much I meant those words. Jessica had been that reset for me, a chance to start fresh, to leave behind the pain and the lies, and to finally let go of the past. Months went by, and with each one, I felt more like myself. Friends who'd seen me at my lowest started commenting on the change, how I looked happier, lighter. My work began to thrive again, and I found myself taking on new projects with a sense of energy I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. One evening, as Jessica and I were preparing dinner at my place, I realized that I'd found something I hadn't expected to find again: contentment. There, in the small routines of life, in the laughter over shared meals, in the quiet moments spent reading together, I'd found a happiness that was genuine and lasting. I looked over at her as she stirred a pot on the stove, humming along to a song playing softly in the background, and I felt a surge of gratitude. When she caught me staring, she laughed. "What? Do I have something on my face?" I shook my head, smiling. "No, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we found each other." She came over and wrapped her arms around me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Me too, Daniel. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." In that moment, I knew that I had finally closed the chapter that Sarah had shattered. I'd found love again, a real love built on respect and truth. And this time, I was wiser, more careful, but not guarded. I knew that with Jessica, I could be myself, fully and honestly, without fear of betrayal. Looking back, I saw now that Sarah's betrayal, painful as it was, had been a turning point. It had forced me to confront what I truly wanted and needed in a relationship. I could no longer settle for half-truths or stay in a relationship where loyalty was taken for granted. In the end, her lies had set me free, giving me the courage to move forward and rebuild my life. With Jessica by my side, I knew that I'd found a new beginning. It wasn't the future I'd originally envisioned, but it was one I could embrace with my whole heart. I had found peace, and for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I wanted to be.